time to grow with the SEO Queen. Receive the perfect leads like never before. No traffic is gonna explode. It's time to grow.
Welcome to the SEO Queen Tech Show, a podcast to help you get more credibility, visibility, and profitability through inspiration, technology, and marketing insight. This podcast is for professionals and entrepreneurs who are looking to get more customers, clients, and patients. We are broadcast worldwide on Bashani Radio, iHeartRadio, and iTunes. Bashani Radio, always talking about everything from New York City. You can listen to the SEO Queen Tech Show on any mobile phone or tablet device. Also, as a thank you gift for listening to the SEO Queen Tech Show, you can go to SEOqueen.com and download the free ebook, 101 Ways to Improve Your Marketing and Sales. In addition, you could always go to SEOqueen.com/conference and learn more information about how you can boost your company's visibility through the Reach More Clients Conference that's happening July 29th, 30th, and 31st. So I am so excited to have today's guest with me. She is Dr. Karen Gedney. She is an internal medicine specialist who spent almost 30 years behind bars as a prison physician. She was designated as one of the best in the business by the American Correctional Association and won a Heroes for Humanity Award for her work in HIV in the correctional system. Her true stories in the book that she authored, it's called 30 Years Behind Bars, Trials of a Prison Doctor, which is available on Amazon, documents the true stories of a young, naive physician who survived a world she was ill-prepared for and turned it into a calling. So without further ado, I would like to introduce to some and present to others none other than today's guest, Dr. Karen Gedney. How are you today?
I'm wonderful, Z, and I really appreciate you having me on your podcast today.
Well, I appreciate you coming on to my podcast today because you have a story that when I met you, I knew my listeners had to hear.
Well, I really appreciate that. And I have to say that it's my experience that very few people have met prison doctors, especially female ones who've done 3 decades in prison and survived and then want to turn it into a calling when they leave.
Right. Absolutely. So let's start from the very beginning. What drew you to medicine? What made you interested in biology and medicine? What drew you to that?
Yeah, that's sort of interesting. I look back at my childhood and you would never expect it because I grew up in upstate New York in the Catskill Mountains, sort of in boony land. Neither one of my parents ever finished high school because of the Second World War. My mother was an immigrant. And for some reason, and I think it was because I was highly nearsighted, the only thing I could see was like close a book, and I loved books. And it was really books. I would read stories about individuals who, let's say, fought against abuses of power. And I especially liked series about doctors who worked at different times in history, pushing all the, let's say, things that no one else would do. And somehow in my mind, at literally 9 years old, I decided I'm going to be a doctor. I had no idea what that was because I hadn't even been to a doctor. But the romance and the intrigue and the danger and fighting for causes, I don't know, just clicked in my brain. And my parents told me, oh, we knew you were going to be a doctor. I said, why? They said, you were already sticking your stuffed animals with needles, in their arms for injections and things like that. And for some reason, I always wanted to be a doctor. And I actually was terrified of ever being in a hospital. And then I had to do everything on scholarships because my parents, they had that German mindset. Well, that's nice. You want to be educated, but we have no idea how to do that. So at 18, you're on your own. So I did everything on my own. I got the scholarships. I worked all the time. And it was a real blessing that I got a major scholarship, the National Health Service Corps scholarship that financed medical school.
Oh, wow.
And that was a complete ride in those days. And what happened is they paid for your tuition, and then they gave you a bit of a stipend for books, supplies, and a teeny bit to live on.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was probably one of the few doctors who left without debt. You see what I mean? Because I had all these scholarships, and also I hardly ever ate and did nothing. You know what I mean? Except work all the time.
Right.
And in return, after your internal medicine residency.
Wait. I have a question. You went through college and you said you hardly ever ate.
Yeah. Well, I mean, yeah, I was eating. That's one of those days in the college where I worked in the snack bar.
Oh,
you see what I mean?
Right.
As sort of their manager. And of course, if they were going to throw away food, I was like, okay, I got to take some of that little food because it's going to be thrown away anyway. So
right.
I had minimal eating in those years, which I don't know has benefited me because I'm still slender, in my old age now, in my 60s.
Yeah.
And
I caught that freshman 15.
Yeah. So, but
working on losing it.
Yeah. Fortunately, I don't have that problem. But imagine after my residency, the government says, okay, you owe 4 years payback. This is how it works. They give you the scholarship. You work 4 years in a place no one else would work. And I assumed that I would be put in an inner city or rural area. In fact, I even interviewed at Cabrini Green in Chicago back in the day.
Wow.
Yeah. And when I got flown out there, I went to one clinic and then I walked to the other clinic through the war zone. I think they all thought I was crazy, And when I ended up at the other clinic, they were like, oh my God, how did you get here? I said, I walked from there to there. Like I walked all that way through Cabrini Green. And they said, what are you, crazy? A woman like you was just murdered there, yesterday. I was like, I had no idea. This is how naive I was. But when I finished interviewing Cabrini Green and went back to Nevada, where I was finishing my residency, they said, we have a spot in Nevada. I was like, really? And they said, yes, we're going to put you in prison. I was like, okay. Now I go from Cabrini into a male security prison in Nevada. And they couldn't get doctors in those days. This is back in the 80s, 1987, because it was just dangerous. They paid basically nothing. And it was, you're working in really horrendous conditions in those days.
Did you have enough medical supplies, or even that was a problem?
Well, yeah, the supplies were so, but let's just say that when I entered, like they had an X-ray little spot, right? And actually my X-ray tech was an inmate. You see what I mean?
Right.
And then my porters, my helpers were inmates, right? And now I did have I had RNs, truly nursing RNs, but they were married many times to the custody officers, which is a very bad nepotistic relationship in prisons where you have custody married to medical and they want to control the inmates. And then I got thrown into the prison. And, here, this is like the good old boy club. Nevada is really known as the Mississippi of the West. And when I entered, I'm this young, tall, blonde, idealistic doctor, and I have no concept of the fact that I'm rocking the boat on so many levels. And then on top of it, my husband, and we had only been married for a couple of months when I got stuck in the prison, was African-American. And Clifton was this good-looking, tall black male, platoon leader, Vietnam, had an MBA in finance. And when we moved to Carson City, Nevada, that small capital has maybe 40,000 people. There were absolutely zero black people, zero, in the whole city. And Clifton was the only one. And the first week we were there, he was stopped and asked for his parole papers, stuff like that. And when I walk into the prison, I realize 1 out of 4 of my patient population, the inmates, are African-American. And I thought, where'd they all come from? It's like, it was such a shock. You're here, you walk there, and it's like, And they had shipped a lot of those guys up from Las Vegas because they didn't have a lot of big prisons in Vegas. The prisons were up near the Capitol because those prisons, one of them was built in 1862 before Nevada was even a state. It was a territorial prison.
Oh, wow.
And then, you see, and then the other prison system was built in the 60s. That's the one I worked at.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. See, so in the big prisons in Vegas didn't get built until probably the 90s or later. So it was a unique situation. And
can you elaborate a little bit more about what it was like when you first started? You moved to Carson City, you and your husband, he's being stopped randomly. You're at this prison with, 25%, Black population. What happened?
Well, what happened was when it was a wild time because 1987 was the height of the HIV epidemic as well.
Okay.
Right before they even had drugs. AZT came out in the fall of 1987. So when I started, I was just oriented to give the best care, and I was pushing things the prison had never experienced. And because I cared about the inmates, they looked at me and labeled me as an inmate lover. Okay. You can imagine this, right? Just because I want to give care, right? So security, custody looked at me as a risk. And then they created investigations on me where and it's complicated, but imagine in a prison, if people complain about you, i.e. custody, they put in their paperwork to the Inspector General's office, and then the Inspector General's office is obligated to basically spy on you and find out whatever they want about you. So then that investigation was going on for months, and it was started by the associate warden at my facility and his wife, who was the nurse, because they controlled that place and looked at me as a risk.
So what were they so concerned about? I mean, you were just treating...
Well, yeah, but they had never had really a real doctor ever treat the inmates. So
they didn't want you to treat the inmates to make them better?
Stand up for them.
Oh.
They don't care. They don't want that. They want to control, right? They want to control. And in their minds, they felt, since she's nice, therefore the inmates are going to get over on her and have her bring in drugs or weapons or who knows what. You know what I mean? That's how they thought.
Right. Okay. I see.
Right? That's how they thought. And the thing is, just because I'm nice doesn't mean I'm stupid. It's like a mother a kid goes, "Mommy, you're pretty. Can I have the cookie on top of the refrigerator?" I mean, this is about
the answer is thank you, but no.
Right. Yeah, right. It's sort of, I mean, this is like human nature. And imagine the prison director at that time, who's head of the entire state. When I heard about all these rumors that I was being investigated, I started getting fearful. I contacted that prison director. And then he said, "Come to my office." And I thought, oh no. I go to his office, and that's in another place. But when I walked in, he stuck this whole pack of like papers in front of me, like a big file that was on me. And I had only been there a year.
Oh, wow.
Only been there a year, but they have the thing in the state. If they can get rid of you before the first year, they don't really have to have a good reason. You see what I mean? It's like a probationary period.
Right.
So there's this investigation, and he puts it in front of me and he said, "Doctor, I never do this because investigations are supposed to be whatever, confidential. But in this case, I want you to read it because I want you to know your enemies so you can get them before they get you." And I was like, wait a second, this is not my type of world, right? And
wait a second. So the overall prison director was on your side.
He was on my side. Yeah.
That's a blessing.
Yeah, he was on my side. And and he's also stepping out of bounds doing something like that. But for him
Right.
to say, I want to know all your enemies, I want you to know your enemies so you can get them. I was like, that's not in me. But when I read it, it was really horrible. They took everything out of context and warped it around. They basically stated that they didn't trust me because I was married to a Black man and therefore I would do better things for the Black inmates. I mean, it
So
was
it was a lot of racism
it
and
was racism,
sexism,
it was sexism, but it was
misogyny.
also, yeah, and also the security mindset that they had never experienced, I think, anybody who had been compassionate. That was like, what is that person doing in a prison? This is crime, pain, punishment, shame. Lock them up, throw away the key. Don't you ever do anything good for them? That type of mindset.
Mm-hmm.
So that made me an outlier. And the other thing is, when I was hired, they had a medical director, like a guy at the top in charge of all the medicine for the state.
Mm-hmm.
So when I started, I met him once for the interview. The next time I met him was 2 weeks later after I started, and he had come back from a vacation where he had collapsed his spine from metastatic cancer, and then boom, was gone. So then I had no one above me in the entire state to tell me what to do, to mentor me, to tell me. So I was like thrown into a shark bin with no protection and also no direction. Like nobody knew what to do with HIV in the early days. Nevada was highly weird and unique as a state because it's sort of homophobic. In 1985, when the test came out, they tested every single inmate in the state. So they knew who was positive, but then they didn't think, well, what do we do with that information, right?
Mm-hmm.
Do we tell the inmate? Do we give education? If there is treatment, what do we do? They didn't know. And I had nobody above me. You see what I mean? So
Mm-hmm.
all of these unique things were given to me, and then I just stepped up because I'm just operating like a doctor. Like, wait a second. If someone's positive, they need to know they're positive. We need to have education so they don't transmit. Because custody was so scared. Custody would know someone was positive and then, make their lives miserable. It was a very ugly situation in those days. So I had to deal with that as
Well, I
well.
have another question. Were there, at that time, were there a lot of trans inmates as well?
No, I had an occasional individual who would, and that's the interesting thing, where you have a male come in, and we had one or two that would have had, the breast enlargements to look like a female, but that was very rare in Nevada, very rare. And I remember like the first individual I had was actually a big guy. He looked sort of like a Schwarzenegger with Dolly Parton, breasts, which
Mm-hmm.
was sort of bizarre in the prison for me. And the Nevada had let's say the mindset, anyone would be housed based on their plumbing. So if they had a penis, they didn't care if the person mentally was a female or even looked like a female. If they had a penis, they were in a male prison. And I remember this poor guy, poor female, but the individual had huge, huge breasts and they needed a bra. I mean, because it was just, killing them.
Right.
And I ordered some huge bra just so the person wouldn't have such pain.
Mm-hmm.
And then I was written up for giving sexual underwear to an inmate. You see what I mean?
Right. Right.
It's like, oh God. Right. Stuff like that, sort of, they were, because they couldn't understand in their minds. It's like, I don't want to like female underwear on a male prison yard. And I'm just like a doctor, like this individual needs support because it's killing them.
Right, right,
it's ripping off their chest there, right?
right.
So, I mean, all
If
these
it's like a
things,
D or a double D or something like that,
right?
you
Yeah,
definitely need that
it
support.
was, yeah, it was extraordinary, the size. I mean, it really, because you could actually see, the stretch marks and the tear going on. It was
Oh,
like way too
wow.
heavy,
Yeah.
way too heavy. And then the biggest thing was when that prison director, like the first year, he protected me, and then he left the prison. And about 6 months later, I was taken hostage in the prison. And to this day,
This is like a year and 6 months into
my 4-year term. Yeah. And to this day, I'll always think and believe that there were certain forces that allowed that to happen. You see what I mean?
Right.
Yeah, but I was taken
They're trying to
hostage.
steer you out of there.
Yeah, I was taken hostage, and the inmate, Kenneth Meller, he had been like a Marine vet in Vietnam and had problems. And he ended up taking me. He had been on life sentence, life without parole.
Mm-hmm.
And he took me hostage. And then 10 hours, I was assaulted, raped, all sorts of bad things happened to me in those 10 hours. And then they got me out with a SWAT team from another city. And they had to do flashbang grenade, and they assaulted the room, and they blew him away maybe 2 or 3 feet from me and killed him. And then when I got out, the warden at that time, just asked some questions, and I was like in shock. I mean, really. And all what I wanted to do was get out of there as quick as possible. And it happened Friday the 13th in October, 1989. And it's a wild story on top of that. But imagine I get out of there because I don't want to tell them what happened to me. You see what I mean? I'm not ready to talk about it. And and even though I was hurt, as a doctor, I'm like, forget it. I'm going to just take care of myself. And on Monday, I'm back at work, and they never called, they never checked. And when I got back to work, no one actually really said anything to me. Not custody, not administration. And when I walked back into my exam room, there was still a hole in the wall where they had sledgehammered the thing and put in the grenade. There was still blood gushing up from the tiles. They cleaned up the majority of the mess, but, you still see bullet holes, blood coming up from the tiles, the hole in the wall. And when you first come back, I have so much adrenaline and so much shock going on. I'm sort of glad no one's, talking to me. But then you realize, or you think, nobody cares at all that I almost died. And then because I'm paranoid because of being prior investigated, I think, who wants me dead that bad to let this happen to me? And it was the inmates who, when they would see me, they would show their compassion. They're the only ones who really sent get well cards. You see what I mean? I mean, they really showed me they cared. And that was one of the things that helped me heal from that event.
Wow.
And I think what maybe the prison world didn't understand was that I was raised by a German mother who survived Russian POW camps, the war. She's 91 now. She's tough to kill. You see what I mean?
Right.
And when I grew up, it was always this mindset of, you don't complain, you fall out of a tree and break a leg, just suck it up or something, right?
Right.
And you never stop working, and you always fight against abusers of power.
Wow.
And so I developed this German stubbornness on top of it, where you want me gone. Well, that's the last thing that's going to happen. That was a piece of it as well, personality wise.
Mm-hmm. So how did that affect your home life, like everything that you went through?
Yeah, well, that was interesting because my husband is, my husband passed away 2 years ago, but he was really, really like a rock of Gibraltar. But he had been a combat vet, so he suspected what happened to me,
Mm-hmm.
but he didn't push it. And it took me probably 2 or 3 weeks before I even told him. And he was one of those, like some people would say to me, "Oh my goodness, how could your husband let you go back to work?" But my husband and I had this sort of mindset of we didn't tell each other what to do with our lives. See what I mean?
Right.
And he was very supportive. And on top of it, I actually pulled him into the prison, my husband, because I saw how many were African American, and they didn't have any role models or, really. And
Mm-hmm.
my husband, since he was a combat vet, there was in the system one African American officer who I really liked, Harold Brown. And Harold Brown was one of the first Navy SEALs in the United States. He had been UDT, which is underwater demolitions in Korea. Then
Okay.
he was sort of grandfathered in as a SEAL in Vietnam. And
Oh, wow.
yeah, it was really
Navy
interesting.
SEALs, no joke.
He and my husband became friends,
Uh,
right? Harold, he lived in another city, but he worked in the system. And he and my husband became friends. And Harold said, we have so many vets, combat vets in the prison, and they've approached me to do a sort of veterans group. And we need an outside person to be sort of like the finance person for the group, if we want to raise money or do anything. And
mhm.
my husband was on board with that
Okay.
because he helped, with the Vietnam Wall. My husband, he was really into that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
Then, because he was into that, the inmates through the grapevine knew I was married to an African American. And then there was a guy on the yard who had been with the NAACP,
Yeah.
the inmate NAACP. And he approached me and said, "Hey, Dr. Gedney, we just got permission to do this whole Martin Luther King Day speech.
Mm-hmm.
But our speaker in Reno canceled at the last minute. Can you please ask your husband to speak?" Right. So I went home and I asked Clifton, "Hey, would you come into the prison in this big gym with, like 1,000 inmates or so, and give a speak for Martin Luther King Day speech?" And he was like, "Why? I'm a finance guy." And I said, no, Cliff, it's because you're Black. This is why you need to come in, right? And I pulled him into that. He gave a great speech. And then the guys asked him, "Hey, Mr. Macklin," because we have different names, "Mr. Macklin, can you teach a Black history course in the college? We want something for us," right?
Mm-hmm.
And he ended up teaching ethnic history of the United States, because what they didn't know about Cliff is Cliff was what I would tease him. He was a mutt, he was German, Black, and Cherokee, right? So he had a real sense of the discrimination against the Native American Indians as well,
Gotcha.
right? And he also, since he loved history, he really understood the other ethnic groups like the Italians and the Irish, who were very much put upon when they first came to the United States as well, right?
Mhm.
So but he gave that course. And then my husband ended up teaching finance, accounting, HR, and he actually taught at all the major 3 prisons in the North. He loved, he loved to teach, and he loved mentoring the inmate population.
Mhm.
And he had a lot of white guys as well who adored Clifton. In fact, in my book, I talk about in the first class, there was one of the Aryan warriors, the white supremacist type guy, sitting in the back watching, what was going on in the first class. And then after everybody left, he actually came up to my husband and he said, Mr. Macklin, if I had an uncle or a brother like you, I wouldn't be in the prison for a lifetime, and my 3-year-old son wouldn't be without a father. And I would love it if you could mentor my son. Now that changed my husband's whole mindset, to be asked by a white supremacist really to mentor his 3-year-old son. And my husband ended up, that was one of the nudges for him to enter the Big Brother, Big Sister organization and mentor kids at risk for parents in prison.
Wow.
Yeah. So he did that. But this day, I think that a lot of the relationships or relations that were on my prison yard at that time dramatically changed because of my husband.
Wow. So explain a little bit about how the relationships change. Your husband is involved, the inmates are looking up to him. Did they start to see the benefit and influence that you both were having and back?
It depended on the prison director. Because prison directors in prisons, at least in my state, they had an average lifespan of 2 to 3 years. So you would get one director who was, let's say, more progressive, and they really liked what, let's say, I was doing, my husband was doing. And then you would get the swing to the more, fixed mindset security side. The one thing I think that helped my husband was because he was military, he was a combat platoon leader. There were a lot of the, let's say, even the good old boy clubs that still valued a military guy. You see what I mean? Because the prison is very much a military structure. Right. And my husband was fortunate in growing up where he had grown up in Hyde Park in Chicago. Okay. And he had grown up, I always teased him, I grew up poor. He grew up with like the silver spoon because his father was a very wealthy real estate guy and his mother was an international pianist who played at Carnegie Hall. You see what I mean? Yeah. But he came from a social strata that was so far away from mine. And he didn't have that, what should I say? He always looked at himself as an elite. So anything where someone would give him a hard time, he would consider them the idiot. You see what I mean? He was never a victim. He was never a victim. And he developed some friends in custody who were combat Vietnam vets. And then we talked about it where he said, Karen, war, when you have a brotherhood in war, he goes, it doesn't matter what color your skin is, blood's thicker than water in war. And one of the, and my husband really got traction when the next prison director was also a combat vet, one of those guys who survived Hamburger Hill in Vietnam.
Oh, wow.
Right. And so that prison director and my husband got along, and that sort of set the custody mindset, like, hey, the prison director is a combat vet. And actually, the warden at that time was a combat vet from Vietnam. And those guys sort of meshed with my husband, and that sort of gave him some traction.
Right.
And once you get traction and legitimacy and in some of the custody and the hierarchy feeling, oh, you're a military combat vet. And, my husband was shot through the chest in Vietnam and lost a lung. I mean, he was a Purple Heart, he was a medal winner and all that sort of stuff. That means something to men,
Right. Wow.
So he, and any, of the smaller guys who were intimidated, my husband was like, doesn't matter.
Yeah. Wow, that's incredible. So now, since you've retired from being a prison doctor, I mean, you've written your book, and
Right.
can you tell us about your book and what you're doing now?
Yeah, the big thing is that when I retired from the prison, I still wanted to help the inmates, but I wasn't exactly sure the best way to do it. But one of the things people had told me over the years, because I would tell them some stories once in a while, plus they see it in the papers, and they would say, "Oh, you got to write a book." And so I kept journals, I kept what inmates wrote, and in the back of my mind, once in a while, I would write a chapter. And then when I left, I decided stories make impact on people. So I'll write a book and I'll start it the day I enter the prison, the day I left, so they could see it, the system through my eyes, not, the inmate side or the custody side, but someone who was naive, like many people are in the outside world. And
Mhm.
then they can see both sides. And I didn't tell them what to think. I just wanted them to experience everything I did, what I felt and did. And I wanted that to impact the reader so they could see the inmate not as a group, but as really individuals that maybe they could resonate with,
Mhm.
and that they would be oriented to become more aware of what was going on in prisons and with incarceration, and how disproportionately the mentally ill, the poor, the minority populations basically get screwed,
Right.
in the criminal justice. I wanted them to see that and understand that. And also the dilemma of inside a prison, when the public is not aware of what's really going on, how that can be very dangerous. And also, depending on who is in charge at a director level, how you can get programs that are progressive or things that just stultify people and
Right.
mess them up.
Yeah.
And that's what I wanted to show.
Yeah. I think a lot of people think that, the prisons really aren't, they don't rehabilitate anyone.
Right.
And
Yes.
I would, I would guess that, the people who have a very, fixed custody mindset, running the prisons, there's no rehabilitation going on.
No, that's they look at it very much like, my job is to incarcerate and make sure they don't escape. End of story. And that when they leave, not my problem. And my message is very much holistic prison reform, where tactics don't work. It's strategy. And you have to have a strategy that prevents individuals from entering it in the first place. If they do enter it, you actually heal and make them less risk than when they leave. And then when they do leave, that you support their re-entry. It has to be a whole picture. When people try to do one little tactic,
Hmm.
that's fine. But if one of those three things aren't working, the system's not going to change. It
Right.
really has to be a holistic approach.
So my final question to you is, what do you see as the way to move forward for the prisons to be more effective and more rehabilitative? Because I believe it's in the public's best interest for the recidivism rate to be reduced. You
Yeah,
know.
absolutely. Yeah. And to me, the largest thing is being aware of those three key points, and then having society, let's say, motivated to affect those three things. And the thing is, when I really was on this mission since the 80s, that wasn't even talked about. Now you see prison reform really being talked about. So instead of just talking about it, there are different organizations and different people really pushing those buttons. But all those three big categories have to be pushed together. You see now less people going into the prisons right now because they're trying to restructure bail and violation. and changing laws to affect mandatory minimums, affecting juvenile systems. So you see this happening, but it has to be continued. And we really also have to look at other countries who are doing it so much better. As an example, Germany. I like to tell people, hey, you look at Germany as an industrialized country, and did you know that they have 10% of the prison population per capita than we do? Just 10%. And that they have half as much violent crimes. Now, to me, if you look at that, you think, okay, now what are they doing so different, right? As a culture.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not just the prisons, it's their culture. They have larger support nets than this country does.
Right.
People who are mentally ill or having problems, there's a net for them. In the United States, there's just huge holes that people drop through and then end up doing things that end up in the system.
Yeah, I think the social safety net is definitely one that needs to be enlarged, and these big corporations who are, really putting the squeeze on people should pay for
Yeah,
these.
I agree. And also the laws have to really be changed because, in Nevada, for example, and this is just an example where in Nevada, there's legislation up where if you have traffic violations and you don't pay them, well, then you have fines, then you have court fines, then you have warrants, and basically you're criminalizing not being able to pay your fines because you're poor. And in fact, Harvard did a big study on Clark County down in Las Vegas, and they pointed out that when you look at the cops stopping people, 70% of the people they were really stopping were the minority population.
Right.
And then that population who's driving without a registered tag or this and that, then they get fines, then they get court fees, then they get warrants, and then they're in jail. And those type of people should not be, and then they plead, then they get the criminal record, and all of this sort of spins them off into getting thrown into a prison down the road.
Yeah, it's horrible. It really is horrible, and so many factors, create this negative synergy. So what I want you to, tell people, how can they connect with you to learn more, to be a part of the change, advocating for change in the prison system, and how can they read your book? I'm definitely going to get your book and read it.
Yeah. Yeah, and I'll send you a copy, Z, if you give me your address.
Okay. A signed copy?
Yeah, a signed copy, of course.
Oh, okay. I would love that. Thank you so much.
And in the book, whoever gets the book, they'll see also artwork from one of the inmates that starts each chapter, because I want to support, my inmates who are in the outside world. But for your people who listen, if they're interested, they definitely should check out my book and get it on Amazon. And they can also go to my website, which is discoverdrg.com. So it's discoverdrgedney.com. And then what I would recommend is, after they read the book and they're actually interested in getting involved in prison reform or trying to be helpful, a lot of people will say, wow, what can one person do? And I'll say something on the order of, first, you want to think about mentoring first a kid at risk, because if we can break the school to prison pipeline, that would be wonderful. And the other thing is, if they're politically interested in legislation, there are definitely groups like the ACLU or other groups in states that will point out legislation that needs to be changed. And I got your address, Z, so you'll definitely get a book. And there are also some people who are sort of fascinated by prisons, and some people don't know they can actually volunteer in many prisons, whether it's through religious groups or sometimes other programs. Some prisons will have entrepreneurial programs.
Mhm.
If you're an employer, you want to take a look at hiring an ex-felon. Certain states have these ex-felons that come out and are bonded. There are tax opportunity credits for companies. There are different reasons why to give someone who's had a prior incarceration record a second chance. Because if you vet them correctly, they can be your most loyal employee because you gave them a second chance. And if they're interested in podcasts, just to get a sense of all the different things going on, I think one of the best ones I personally like is something called Decarceration Nation. And they're one of the last episodes I listened to, they had Van Jones, on it, who is also very much into prison reform.
Right.
And
He's been working with Kardashian, getting her.
Right.
She's working on becoming an attorney, and she's also been working on prison reform as well.
Right. Yeah. So they're different organizations that they can look into. But the biggest thing I think is first to become interested. In my book, I think gives a person a sense of why in retirement, I've chosen to take this on, to be an advocate for prison reform. And in my state right now, they're trying to abolish the death penalty, so I've written newspaper articles and I'm trying to throw my voice as a prison doctor, because in 1989, I was asked to write for the drugs for execution, right? Because it was my job. And I refused.
Right.
And just about the death penalty in general, the more people understand how unjust and least cost effective, and it doesn't deter crime, and innocent people are on death row. There's so many reasons why this country should abolish the death penalty across the road, across all states.
The biggest reason is because the justice system is so flawed, and
yes,
people get whether it's criminal or civil or even business, there's always these lawsuits that are frivolous, these actions that are wrong, people who lie under oath. It's just too many things that aren't fair in the process.
Yeah. In fact, they did a study like in Las Vegas in Clark County, where they looked at the men on death row. And what they found is that of the death row cases, 47% of the cases in Clark County, where you have the large population of African Americans, 47% had prosecutorial misconduct. Wow. So imagine that. I mean, these are death row cases.
And you can't have that, and this is a person's life.
Right. And the thing is, in the death row, some people think it deters crime, but all the studies show no, it doesn't deter crime, because people who do violent acts, emotional, illogical, mentally ill acts, or just they got some loose wires up there.
Right. They're not thinking
about logic in deterrence. That's just not what happens.
I've been watching on Netflix. They have a lot of different docu-series and different things about people on death row, people committed crimes. And one thing that I was struck by is how many of them really didn't have stable home lives. They didn't have romantic relationships, familial relationships, parental relationships. They're, people who feel, isolated, forgotten, and, for whatever reason, they just, got caught in a really bad situation. Like there was one guy who basically blacked out and killed his family who he loved. And it's like he had no coping skills. They didn't know how to, manage his anger. He didn't know how to breathe and take a time out. It's just all these things that to do, I know to do, my
Right.
child is being raised to do. But there are people who don't have um, that social norming, that support to understand how you deal with certain things, these soft skills, these soft coping skills. And I'm with you. I think death row is really, it's sad, you know.
Yeah, and we're really the only industrialized country out there that actually has the death penalty. And supposedly we are the, land of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But there's so much that the United States has that it's hard to wrap your mind around the injustice
Right.
and the racism, and the unfairness of what happens with people.
Mm-hmm.
They want it both ways, but they have to be honest when they look at the whole picture that our system is highly flawed. And,
Right.
it's taken, most people don't even realize that, if you look at incarceration rates, in the late 70s, we were like the rest of the world, late 70s, rest of the world. And then from the late 70s up until 2000, we literally quadrupled and quintupled our incarceration rate per capita. No other country did that.
I think the reason why is because during that time frame, you had the war on drugs.
That's right. That was the biggest thing. But also you had mandatory minimums
And the three
and,
strikes law. Three strikes
and
laws went into
three laws, 3 strikes and you're out, and all these really heavy-handed things. And then even the thought of giving, a life sentence to a juvenile exists. I mean, it's crazy. No other country does that.
Yeah. And then you have the stories of, like, I think it's called the Central Park Five.
Oh, right, yeah.
All these stories and these confessions that are made under duress.
Right.
I mean, it's so much that goes on that needs to stop. And so I definitely applaud you for, in spite of everything you've went through,
Yeah.
wow, to still, have compassion and empathy and being able to stand. So please go to Dr. Gedney's website. It is discoverdrg.com. You can read about her book, learn how you can get involved, and also learn how you can also volunteer in the prisons. I think this is definitely something that, as an entrepreneur, as a professional, you all should consider giving an inmate a second chance by getting them a job.
Yes.
Jobs make peace.
Right.
So thank you so much, Dr. Gedney, for being on the podcast. And until next time.
Yeah, and Zhe, this was wonderful talking to you, and you'll definitely get my autograph book, and hopefully you'll tell others about it. And I think you'll like the artwork too.
All right. Thank you so much. And I'm looking forward to reading your book.
Okay, Zhe.